Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this joint DAAD German Hub and Center for Geopolitics event. My name is Brendan Sims. I'm the director of the center. I think it's fair to say that Germany at the moment is in something of a crisis that perhaps was not one could have foreseen towards the end of the last decade when German economy was doing very well. Chancellor Angela Merkel was being seen almost as a kind of the new leader of the free world as she was being hailed. And many other things seemed to be going very well and right for Germany. In more recent times, the last couple of years, we've had economic crisis. We've had, of course, the Zeitenwende, the great breach in the relationship with Russia. We have had a political crisis, which will come to a culmination at the beginning of next year. And we've also had a certain crisis of German identity and a certain fragmentation within Germany. And a very important part of that fragmentation has been, of course, the uncompleted project in many ways of German unification, which is what we are going to be talking about this evening. And who better to talk about that than Professor Dirk Oschmann. Dirk was born in Gotha in 1967. He did his PhD at the University of Jena and is now professor at the University of Leipzig. He is, as it were, in his day job, an expert on 18th through to 20th century German literature. I want to single out two books here in particular, Poetry in Motion, Theory of Language and Poetics in Lessing, Schiller and Kleist, published in 2006, and Freedom and Estrangement, Kafka's novels, published in 2021. But of course, the reason why he's here tonight is this book, a somewhat incendiary book, as some thought, but certainly a book that has provoked us to think again and differently about this project of German reunification. Der Osten eine westdeutsche Erfindung, the east of Germany, an invention of the West Germans. So without much more ado, Dirk, over to you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear students and colleagues, this lecture will mainly deal with the question of belonging, or to cut it short and exaggerate at the same time, does East Germany belong to Germany at all? It will focus on the public discourse and its effects, the discourse that is dominated by Western German perspectives, West German media, West German politicians. Hence, this framing produces multiple forms of separation and exclusion that are devastating for the social cohesion of the entire country. However, when I offered the topic for this lecture, I couldn't possibly anticipate or even know that the political situation would be entirely different, with Donald Trump as president-elect, with the German government that has fallen apart, and is a lame duck, and most of all, Pep Guardiola, who lost 4 games in a row for the first time in his career. The world has truly changed a lot. I would like to talk about the topic of belonging today because it is of particular importance in view of an increasingly polarized society, not only in Germany. When Donald Trump was elected for the first time in 2016, many Americans said, "Not my country anymore." Many Britons probably felt the same way after the Brexit decision in the same year. They no longer felt they belonged to their country. The title of Ali Russell Hochschild's book, which was published also 2016, fits in with this. Strangers in their own land, anger and mourning in the American right. When it comes to the topic of belonging, people in Germany immediately think of the statement made by the former federal president Christian Wulff in 2010. Islam belongs to Germany. However, it was the former federal minister of the Interior, Wolfgang Schäuble, who coined the phrase 4 years before the future federal president. In 2006, the Islam Conference met for the first time on Schäuble's initiative. Back then, Schäuble said in his opening speech, quote, "Islam is part of Germany and Europe," unquote. The sentence was always accompanied by categorizing and supplementary references, such as to Europe or the Jewish-Christian influences of German culture. This was also Christian Wolff's approach when he gave his speech on the 20th anniversary of German unity on the 3rd of October in 2010. Quote, "Christianity is undoubtedly part of Germany. Judaism undoubtedly belongs to Germany. That is our Christian-Jewish history. But Islam is now also part of Germany," unquote. His successor, Joachim Gauck, who is a Protestant theologian, made it clear that this sentence was and is not a matter of course. He set himself apart from his predecessor right at the beginning of his term of office. Quote, "No, he did not adopt the phrase," Gauck replied at the end of May 2012 to a corresponding question in a Zeit interview and explained, quote, "I would have simply said that the Muslims who live here belong to Germany," unquote. One-sentence formulations about belonging are always problematic, especially when it comes to such delicate matters as religion, Gauck said. Former Saxon Prime Minister Stanislav Tillich went even further in 2015 with the provocative exaggeration, quote, "Muslims are welcome in Germany and can practice their religion, but that does not mean that Islam belongs to Saxony," unquote. This assertion in turn prompted former GDR opposition activist and longtime SPD member for the state parliament, Frank Richter, to dedicate an entire book to this legitimate question in 2019, which is also in the title, quote, "Does Saxony still belong to Germany?" unquote. No matter how you look at it, you can immediately see that and how the question of belonging can lead directly into the pain zones of our present-day society. This applies in particular to the situation within Germany, which I have been forced to deal with more and more in recent years. I would like to start with an anecdote from the second half of the 1970s, which Frank Richter relates in the book mentioned above, because it vividly summarizes key aspects of the West-East divide. Quote, "A schoolmate's family had announced a visit from the West. One day, the classmate told me that the relatives from southern Bavaria had got lost on the roads of eastern Saxony. They had driven too far and only turned off the motorway near Bautzen. From then on, they only came across bilingual signposts and place names. As they had no idea that that part of the original settlement area of the Sorbs was in the east of the GDR, they panicked. Where were they? Were they already in Poland or even in Russian military territory? Sorbian is a Slavic language. It was also an official language in some regions of the GDR. The visitors from the West did not know this. They literally lacked orientation. When they arrived at their destination unscathed after a long odyssey, their first question was, is Saxony still part of Germany?" Unquote. However, Frank Richter not only posed this question, Frank Richter not only posed this question himself afterwards, but also formulated an invitation in the title of another book, Hört endlich zu, which is Listen at Last. For me, this is no coincidence. In German, zuhören and zugehören seem to be very similar due to the alliteration and the assonance. Although there is no etymological connection between zuhören and zugehören, it is between listening and belonging, there is a factual one. Insofar as one can generally observe that those who do not belong or are not supposed to belong are usually not listened to. In the words of the French social philosopher Jacques Rancière, they are not heard. The reverse is also true. Those who belong are listened to. If you look up the word Zugehörigkeit in the Grimm dictionary, you will find the following. Zugehörigkeit corresponds to today's predominant use of zugehörig. Here, belonging is interpreted legally in terms of homeland. So you belong to this land in sense of homeland. The adjective zugehörig in turn has several facets. Zugehörig in the sense of persons are relatives. Zugehörig in the sense of things are possessions. In the third variant, zugehörig means that something belongs together spatially, which is why older version also uses the word zusammengehörig, so belong together. And finally, there is a temporal understanding. The noun zugehöriger expresses a permanent relationship. Now one could provisionally say that zugehörig here is a word that primarily indicates a state of possession. In terms of East-West in Germany, this means that the East formally belongs to the West politically. You would never say the opposite. For example, the West belongs to the East. You always say the East belongs to the West. This alone shows the asymmetry in the country, indeed the hierarchy. And it should actually be economically correct. The East belongs to the West. 90% of residential property in Leipzig belong to West Germans, 80% in Halle. So again, if the pun is allowed, der Osten gehört dem Westen, aber gehört er auch zum Westen. The East is often owned by the West, but does it also belong to the West? Does it even belong to Germany in a specific sense? Is the country not deeply divided? The diagnosis of the polarization or division of society has become a common sense self-description for Western democracies in recent years. A division is, of course, an expression of the fact that something no longer seems to belong or should belong. Of course, the loss of social cohesion that can be observed everywhere and the accompanying tendencies toward individualization and singularization work differently from country to country. This is particularly evident when comparing Germany with England and the USA, when it comes to the question of a divided society. In contrast to England and the USA, Germany has a multi-party system. In England, there are only two options. Either you follow Labour or you follow the Tories, basically. The same applies to the USA, where you have to choose between Republicans and Democrats. The two-party political system can therefore directly encourage a division in society, as the election results of the recent past clearly show. Here, society is visibly splitting into two camps of almost equal size. This also applies to the Brexit decision in the UK, where 17.4 million voted in favor of leaving the EU and 16.1 million against. You could say that although societies are divided, they all belong together. That, of course, is the question. Formally, everyone certainly belongs, but not everyone still feels that way. However, as sociologists emphasize, contemporary German society does not appear to be so extremely divided. Steffen Mau, for example, has pointed out that there is still a large and relatively stable center of society in Germany, where individuals' value decision and ideas about life are still relatively close to each other, even in an East-West comparison. This can be seen not least in voting behavior, because in contrast to England and the USA, there are many swing voters here who vote CDU today or CDU today, Greens tomorrow, and perhaps FDP the day after tomorrow, or who fluctuate between SPD, left, and Greens from time to time. This phenomenon of swing voters exists in the democratic center in all directions, with the significant exception of the AfD. Here, people do not switch, they simply migrate. If I understand it correctly, the AfD's current strength is due to the fact that it is gaining voters from all parties, including the Greens, their greatest enemies, basically. And with the BSW, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, a new political force has emerged, at least in the East for the time being, which combines left-wing and right-wing positions. All parties in the democratic center are losing ground rapidly. The CDU, the CSU, the FDP, which is therefore particularly weak at the moment. The left, which has lost its image as a caring party to the AfD, but of course also the SPD, even though Chancellor Scholz vehemently denies this. Steffen Mau sums up the situation by speaking of a reasonably stable center and at the same time highlighting a radicalization of the fringes. On top of this, noting that the left is losing voters to the AfD means remembering that former communists in France, for example, are now often voting for Le Pen, i.e. have switched from the far left to the far right. You can see this also with Sarah Wagenknecht, who was a communist or the communist platform and is now rather on the right conservative side. The French sociologist Didier Eribon described this phenomenon impressively for the milieu of his family in the now famous 2009 book, Return to Reims. The international view of the similarities and differences in Western democracies is important because it shows the huge social problems that neoliberalism has created over the last 30 to 40 years. And of course, the growing right-wing populism and right-wing radicalism is one of the negative effects of globalization, not only in Germany, but also in Italy, France, the USA, Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Spain, and Turkey. And the list is by no means exhaustive. In Austria, Herbert Kickl of the FPÖ, who campaigned with slogans from Hitler, he called himself or calls himself a Volkskanzler, who campaigned with slogans from Hitler and Goebbels, received 31% of the vote in the last election. 31%. This corresponds pretty much exactly to the figures recently achieved by the AfD in the state elections in Thuringia, Saxony, and Brandenburg. One aspect that is exacerbating the situation in Germany is, of course, the difference between West and East, which is definitely a question of belonging, as the East does not seem to belong to Germany in many respects. On the basis of such and similar theses, the journalist Ines Geipel accused me in a completely absurd review, and she was not the only one, of wanting to divide the country with my book. What a nonsense. Nothing is further from my mind. I'm not dividing the country, I'm describing the processes of division and secession that have existed for over 30 years and have been initiated and maintained by the West. These must be first recognized and understood in order to be able to work towards real reunification. This is not about equality of living conditions, because that does not exist anywhere and would remain an illusion. It is, however, about what democracy must fundamentally achieve, namely the creation of equal opportunities and equal chances of participation for everyone throughout the country. If you look at statements made by politicians, portrayals in the media, or decisions made in the business world, it seems that even in 2024, the East will still not be the Germany that the West would like to see and be seen as. This can be observed anew every week, and I would like to give you some very recent examples. At an event in Falkensee in Brandenburg last year, for example, the aforementioned Chancellor Scholz made it clear who he believes should and should not be part of it. Protesters at the event called for an end to arms deliveries to Ukraine and called on Scholz and the German government to endeavor to end the war in Ukraine through diplomacy. However, instead of presenting real counter-arguments, as would be appropriate for democratic communication at eye level, Scholz let the screamers, as he called them, know that they had no understanding in their brains. Those with brains belong, the others don't. It is doubtful that such statements, indeed that such behavior towards people who hold a different position, a different perspective, will weaken the AfD. Are people no longer allowed to think anything other than what the Chancellor thinks? And is it only the Chancellor who thinks? Wouldn't it be perhaps worth considering what others think? What if they were right? But this kind of questioning, doubting, and self-doubt does not even arise, because it is clear from the outset what must be right. And would the Chancellor have said something like that in Münster or Munich, or to the huge crowds of esoterics, corona deniers, conspiracy theorists, so-called right-wing thought leaders, and other protesters in southwest Germany, where they all crowd? Hardly ever. But you can say, basically, this is due to the anthroposophic tradition they have there. But you can't say that to East Germans because you can say anything to them and about them that you wouldn't be allowed to say about any other social group. There is no shame, no decency, no boundaries here. From the perspective of the completely West German norm, the East only appears as a catastrophic deviation. In view of the unfortunately long tradition of West German politicians talking to East Germans and about East Germans, the Chancellor's verbal gaffe is just further proof of the discursive asymmetry in the country. This asymmetry is also an integral part of journalistic reporting on the East. In its simplest form, the East does not appear here at all, as if it did not exist or did not count anyway. It just doesn't belong to Germany. This was the title of the July issue of the Zeitgeschichte Wunderjahre magazine in 2023. How the economic boom after 1945 shaped our country. Well, the economic boom only occurred in the west of our country, while in the east of our country, reparations were paid to the Soviet Union to such an extent that in the end, the people in the East paid 130 times as much per capita in reparations, while the West was able to become free and rich thanks to the Marshall Plan. The word "our" in the phrase "our country" is intended to have an integrative effect and include everyone, but de facto radically excludes all East Germans with their historical experience and their current life opportunities. In the "our," what is one's own is delicately but clearly separated from the foreign, the non-belonging, which remains invisible. To give you a second example, in spring 2024, there was a report on Deutschlandfunk, the equivalent to BBC Radio, about the fact that 30 years ago, in 1994, the paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexuality, was abolished in Germany. In this context, the history of the paragraph was also presented in the German Empire, in the Weimar Republic, in the so-called Third Reich, and then in the FRG until 1994. However, the fact that the GDR had already abolished the paragraph in 1968 was not mentioned. When I asked the broadcaster, they said there was no time for this. There should have been no time for historically accurate and complete reporting, or did the journalists simply not know? Are these the new journalistic standards at Deutschlandfunk? Or does the historical emancipation advantage of the East simply not fit at this point? Perhaps the paragraph would not have been abolished in 1994 if it had not already been abolished in the GDR. And perhaps it would have been interesting and surprising for listeners from the West to learn about this emancipation lead of almost 3 decades in the East. Incidentally, this also applies to the abortion paragraph 218, which the GDR abolished back in 1972, France in 1975, but which is still in force today in Germany and continues to deprive women of their right of self-determination. I then pointed out to the station that it is called Deutschlandfunk and not Westdeutschlandfunk, and that it should please present German history after 1945 in its entire complexity, instead of making the history of the FRG the standard history and largely ignoring the history of the GDR and the East German federal states. Yet we are dealing here with communicating pipes, to say the least. When the East appears in the media, it is almost exclusively as a pathological case. And I will show you a couple of Spiegel covers. They are presented at random from the 90s, but also from today. And here it is interesting. This one is famous. And the journalists who made that, so the reporter and the designer of the cover, They were asked last year what they say to this. And they said, well, the article was wrong and the facts were wrong, but it was well done. So, also in German, es war handwerklich hervorragend. Yeah, real craftsmanship, but wrong. This is crazy. Yeah? The figures they had were wrong. That's the fact. And they admitted it, but yet they said, well, great craftsmanship. And this is my favorite, of course. I wrote about the book. I wrote about it in the book. And here it is important to see there is an image of the ever-whining East German, yeah, der Jammer-Ossi. The East German is always whining like somebody like me. This is a whining book I've written. Of course, I can't help it. When the East appears in the media, it is almost exclusively as a pathological case. A still harmless favorite metaphor is that of lagging behind. The East is lagging behind in terms of economic performance, for example, or in the expansion of fast internet or digitalization. Wherever you look, the East is lagging behind. The real pathological aspect, however, is that the East is extremely right-wing extremist. This is evidenced by the high percentage figures for the AfD, which also has double-digit figures in the West, but which are significantly higher in the East, currently at over 30% in Saxony and Thuringia, and also Brandenburg. The figures are threatening, but there is little question as to how they come about and whether the simple equation of far right and AfD is appropriate and generally conducive to understanding the situation. I mentioned Austria already. Until recently, many of the current potential AfD voters voted for the CDU, CSU, FDP, the left, the SPD, without realizing that they were obviously right-wing extremists. Instead, reference is now being made to the dictatorship socialization of most East Germans and the supposedly associated longing for an authoritarian state, which should preferably be led by a so-called strong man. And of course, the East Germans' capacity for democracy is fundamentally questioned. If this is supposed to be the pattern of explanation, how do you explain the 31% of Herbert Kickel's FPÖ, the election results in the Netherlands, in France, in the USA? I would say not at all. And we should also not forget that especially young people from 18 to 35 voted for the AfD without having any experience of East German dictatorship whatsoever. A study published by Leipzig-based sociologists Elmar Brehler and Oliver Decker in the summer of 2023 on right-wing extremist attitudes in the East now seems to confirm the thesis that East Germans lack the capacity for democracy. That's a quote, lack the capacity for democracy. This once again proves what everyone thinks they have always known, namely that East Germans are basically all Nazis, just as Springer CEO Matthias Döpfner recently announced. The two sociologists may teach in the East, but of course they originally come from the West, as do almost all professors at East German universities anyway, not to mention West German universities. The assembled national press, which is also entirely West German, pounced on this study with great satisfaction and at the same time celebrated it with relief as a refutation of some of the theses of my book. I would say, however, that they rejoiced too soon and in the wrong place. Firstly, other sociologists have now sharply criticized the study, for example, because of two of the usual response categories were missing from the survey, namely no answer or don't know. And because the mean values were negatively standardized, which is also unusual, imprecise, and strictly speaking, simply inadmissible. Quote, one should not trivialize the situation, but neither should one distort it, as the sociologist Steffen Mau wrote in a response to my question about his assessment of the study. And secondly, it would of course have been crucial to conduct the same survey in the West in order to have a comparative value, but this did not happen. Looking only at the East here also means excluding it from the overall social context and denying that it belongs. On the contrary, it is once again pathologized in the familiar manner as a deviation from the West German norm. The critical objections to the study, which were immediately raised by experts, did not play a role in the overall reception. As a result, nothing was read about it in the press. People didn't want to hear about it because it would have undermined the simple truth they believed themselves to be in possession of. What is even more important and significant with regard to the way the press handled the study is how it weighed the results. Only the high percentage of right-wing extremist attitudes, which is around 10 to 15%, was discussed. Brehler and Decker subsequently pointed out that these attitude patterns are almost identical in the West, if the socio-economic foundations are similar. That means if similarly precarious living conditions prevail, for instance in Pforzheim or in Gelsenkirchen or in Deggendorf or in other places. When asked how many East Germans, that means if similarly precarious living conditions prevail. And of course, the press has deliberately ignored a complex of questions which, in my view, provides crucial clues to understanding the overall situation. When asked how many East Germans consider democracy to be the best form of government, over 90%, I repeat, over 90% answered yes. In response to the follow-up question of how many East Germans value democracy based on the basic law, the Grundgesetz, over 70% still voted yes. So you can see 30% for the AfD and 70% say, well, democracy is the best thing we can get on the basis of the Grundgesetz. However, when asked whether they agree with democracy as they experience it every day, only around 40% answered yes. There was no mention of this anywhere in the press, because it would immediately lead to huge explanatory problems. After all, these values cannot be explained by supposed GDR dictatorship, socialization, but on the contrary, only by the direct experience of democracy in the Federal Republic over the last 30 years. That means by the policies of the established parties, from which many voters in East and West are increasingly turning away. That means by that representative parliamentary democracy in which the East is de facto absent as a co-shaping force and which repeatedly makes it clear that it does not really belong to this country. I now come to the latest examples from the economy. Here too, the mechanisms of exclusion are in full swing. Here too, the affiliation of the East is being systemically undermined. Firstly, two brief examples. At a reading in Dresden, I learned that the Bosch company pays its employees in the West inflation compensation, but not in the East. And this in view of the fact that the risk of poverty is 6 times higher in the East in 2024, 6 times higher. Now, cynicism is nothing new in business, but it can also be found in taxpayer-funded public service organizations. 34 years after accession, in Berlin, the beautiful capital of our beautiful and officially reunified country, at the Berlin State Library, the Staatsbibliothek, wages are still paid differently in the western part of the city than in the eastern part, which is why, for example, employees cannot move from one institution to another. It is from one state library west to the state library in the east and vice versa. It's 1.2 kilometers distance, and they have different wages. And who is dividing the country? It's not me. How this can be justified politically, economically, legally, or even in terms of democratic theory and practice is a mystery to me, but above all, it is an expression of the utmost contempt for the people employed in the eastern part of the city. So, by the way, there is a beloved question by sociologists put to East Germans: do you feel as a second-class person? And East Germans usually answer, yes, we do feel as second-class persons. This is the wrong question. The question is correctly, are you treated like a second-class person? And you are, because on average, you get 20% lower wages. In parts, 40% lower wages. If you are in the textile industry, it's 69% lower wages between East Germany and West Germany. It's not a question of feeling or that East Germans have the wrong feelings. they are treated in this way. And one last example. In early summer 2023, an article appeared in the Berliner Zeitung about a packaging plant in Beeskow in Brandenburg. Last year, the plant's employees had been fighting to receive the same pay as employees at the other two sites in North Rhine-Westphalia and Lower Saxony. At east, that means in the west. This involved a whopping 800 euros per month. After a long labor dispute, an increase of 600 euros was granted and accepted in Beeskow, until the idea of closing the plant in Beeskow without further ado in spring 2023. If the East suddenly wants halfway equal pay for equal work, the maximum punishment follows on its heels, namely total exclusion. Occasionally I hear the cynical argument that it is the East's own fault if it does not fight back and takes action against abuses. These examples, however, show the high risk involved in trying to fight for one's rights. In all these and other cases, politicians apparently see no need to intervene for the sake of democratic justice and stability, as if the economic and social had nothing to do with each other. Let me remind you that people in the East generally earn more than 20% less money anyway. So it should come as no surprise that democratic approval ratings in the East are pretty much exactly 20% lower, and that the AfD is gaining more and more support. You can quote Bill Clinton here, "It's the economy, stupid." And please don't tell me about the supposedly lower cost of living. On closer inspection, this proves to be a groundless assertion, because this long has since ceased to be the case. There is no doubt that there is political support for economic policy in the East. The latest and most important measures are the subsidized large-scale investments in Dresden. And yet it remains to be seen what effects will be produced here. For example, a widening of the urban-rural life. An acquaintance who works in Glashütte, the famous watch manufacturing site in the Erzgebirge, told me that the highly specialized skilled workers there are just waiting to apply to the Taiwanese chip manufacturer in Dresden in the hope of achieving higher salaries, which puts the survival of the Glashütte site itself in question. And of course, it remains to be seen whether East Germans will be able to establish themselves in management leadership positions. For a while, I thought that everything was on the right track, that the growing together of what belongs together that Willy Brandt had hoped for was progressing. The most important positions in the country were occupied by East Germans. Angela Merkel as federal chancellor, Joachim Gauck as federal president, Matthias Sommer as sports director at FC Bayern Munich, and me as a professor of modern German literature at the University of Leipzig. However, Gauck and Sommer and now Angela Merkel have resigned from their posts. I intend to stay for a while, but that doesn't change the actual main problem between East and West, which has at least occasionally been addressed publicly in recent years. Leaving aside the completely irreparable economic imbalance, it is the serious underrepresentation of East Germans in top social positions. The cynical, structural, institutional, and above all personal disadvantage of the East is one of the greatest areas of conflict in the latent and manifest East-West divide. The proportion of East Germans in top positions in science, administration, justice, media, and business currently averages 1.7%, and it should be 20%. One example may suffice to illustrate the situation. Only one of the 108 German universities is currently headed by an East German, or as the newsletter of the Center for Higher Education Development put it in March 2022, I quote, "Typical university management, late 50s, male and West German," unquote. The reasons for the enormous underrepresentation of East Germans can be generalized for all areas of society. The system elites from the West demonstrably only recruit from themselves. But nothing reminds the East so much of being East and of being fixed ex negativo to an Eastern identity as this total exclusion in terms of social and economic policy. Accordingly, the East can only feel mocked when Sunday speeches and other occasions speak of diversity, diversification, integration, inclusion, and whatever other empty phrases are used to invoke cultural diversity and social cohesion, because it is never included. However, ladies and gentlemen, belonging certainly looks very different indeed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and I'm delighted your voice held out, and hopefully it will last another 30 minutes or so, which we've got for discussion. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up. The first question is to do with the reception of your book and your argument, which you alluded to on a number of occasions, which was fairly controversial, very, very large, and was a big event. And I wondered whether that surprised you in and of itself, and was there anything about the individual reactions in both the positive and the negative sense that surprised you? Somebody who you might have thought would have been supportive actually wasn't, and somebody who was you thought might be anti but actually was quite sympathetic.
Well, I lost two friends on occasion of the book, two close friends. Basically my oldest friend who went to school with me together in the early 70s, in the 70s and 80s. And I also lost a friend from West Germany, so it's equal in the representation. I got a lot of positive reactions from friends and from acquaintances and from unknown people. Still today, I get emails every day about the book. Still, it was published in February last year, so 1.5 years ago. And I couldn't possibly anticipate the big resonance all over Germany and even in Europe. The book was translated into Polish, for instance, and Polish sociologists told me if you hadn't written the book, we had to do it, because you have the same hierarchy between Germany and Poland. And this is a very sad and shameful tradition that Germans think they can somehow look down on Polish people. It dates back in the 18th century, basically, in the Enlightenment period, when Herder started to develop its climate cultural theories about East and West and North and South. And then in the 19th century, you can see how the semantics of East somehow starts to dominate, or the toxic semantics of East start to dominate the discourse, and this is applied within Germany and within Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So I was really surprised. I couldn't possibly know what was going on. If you are a literary critic or work in the Germanistic as a scholar for German literature, it's a very small, very calm pond you are rowing on. And now this is the open sea of history and politics. And this is truly something else. And me and my family, we live in a state of exception since 2022.
So one of those whom you praise...
Maybe just one more answer to your question. When I wrote the book, I had to think, what is new about what I'm writing? So nothing is new, and I knew it. Yeah? Nothing what I'm saying is new. You will not get any additional information, basically. So I had to think, what can I contribute? And I thought there could be two things: my subjective or my personal perspective on the topic, and the second one is the tone in which the book is written. Usually East Germans don't dare to write in such a tone. This seems to be, in German I would say frech. Yeah, it's not allowed. East Germans are not allowed to speak that way, and usually they don't. And that's why I thought, well, let's try something else. And it's the tone that produces the resonance. And it's not what I'm saying, but how I'm saying it.
So one of those whom you praised in the book, Ilko Sasha Kowalczyk, and of course you'd written in some ways in similar terms about the takeover of the East by the West, actually then seemed very unhappy with what you'd written.
He's very unhappy.
In his recent volume, Der Freiheitsschock. And I mean, his essential argument, as you know, is that you've neglected the importance of freedom in this story. So how do you respond to that? And do you think that's really all that's about, or is there more?
To start with the beginning, Ilko Sasha Kowalczyk wrote me an email 4 days after the publication of my book. He had already read it, and he offered the do in his email because he was so fascinated and he was so fond of the book. And he said, well, what an important contribution to the political debate, and I wish you much success. And then the success came. And then the envy came with Ilko Sasha Kowalczyk. And he's leading a campaign for more than 1.5 years against my person. He says as an opportunist. He has hit himself in order to make career, and now he pops up and writes such a book. It's somehow not understandable, and we shouldn't tolerate that. And then he calls his book an anti-Oschmann. Even the publishing house has it on the homepage, the webpage, Freiheitsschock, ein Anti-Oschmann. So he needs my name in order to sell his book, which is quite interesting. And I think with the book, I talked to somebody today, and we were agreeing on the fact that he's basically revoking his earlier book, The Takeover, because what he's saying there is basically what I'm arguing for, and now he's somehow turned around and said, well, East Germans have not emancipated from dictatorship, and they don't understand freedom, they don't understand liberty, and that's why they want to have an authoritarian leader. And I don't believe it. I think it's not an argument that you can follow, and when you see how he is attacking all the people who vote for a different opinion, be it Christina Morina, the historian, be it Steffen Mau, be it Jenny Erdenbeck, be it Katja Heuer, who is here, and everybody who is not in his track and everybody who is somehow successful is attacked by him. And it's almost a pathological case, I have to admit.
Thank you. For those of you who think that was a planted question, I didn't actually know the backstory there, but I'm very glad I asked. I'm familiar with the book, of course.
We have discussed it a couple of times. And usually we talk with each other in a way that in Germany you would call it aneinander vorbeireden. I don't know how to say it in English.
Talking past each other, I guess.
Yeah, that's what's going on the podiums. And it just happened in the Berliner Ensemble 2 weeks ago. And we can reenact this once in a while.
So a final question from me before we open up to the audience, and that's to do with the question of Ukraine and East Germany's response, in general, overall response. Obviously there are nuances. And you touched on this with respect to the Chancellor's response to hecklers. And obviously the way in which he responded is not conducive to a rational discussion. But there's still, I think, a question to be answered, which is why there is so much skepticism about supporting Ukraine in the GDR, because counterintuitively you might think if you have been occupied by the Russians for a long time, suffered lack of freedom, some people might say a brave people in the East defending itself, one can think of many reasons why you might expect that East Germans, like, for example, Poles, would be sympathetic to Ukrainians, but that is not the case.
It's not the case.
How do you explain it?
I don't have any explanation at all. Last year I was asked by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung to write an article on this, and I said, well, I don't understand it by myself. I don't have any explanation. I can't just simply understand it.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, questions. It'd be helpful if you gave your name and your affiliation if you have one. Yes, I know who you are, but nevertheless, yeah.
My name's Chris Clark. I thought that was terrific. Thank you very much. And it astonishes me that anyone doesn't see the problem that you're referring to. And it's interesting to me that you, as a Germanist, as it were, as someone who's attentive to language and discourse, that you've been able to see this, and the contours and the scope of the problem were apparent to you in a way that seems to have escaped the attention of a lot of people, in particular in West Germany. But my question, and so I have really two questions. The first one was about the timing of all, the temporality of this sort of, what would you call it, pushback of emotion in the new federal states. And there the question is there a sense in which there's a generational dimension to this? Are people processing the experiences of their parents? Is that an important part? Because one of the striking things about the AFD is the success that it's had with young people in the new federal states. And the other question was, why did you begin with Islam? And the question of whether Islam belongs or not. Because, the number of Muslims in the new Bundesländern is absolutely tiny. In Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and Brandenburg and which is the other, Thüringen, it's below 1%, between 0.6 and 0.8. And so on. So why did you start with Islam? Was that just in order to thematize the question of belonging?
That would be the short answer. It just popped up when I started to think about the question of belonging. So that would be the short answer. It might not be the most genuine idea, but that's what I tried to start with. And to the other two questions, I think what I was able to do, which I understood afterwards, is to think outside the box. There was a big article by Jana Hensel, who the writer and a journalist, and she wrote an article in the Zeit last year which is called After the Shock. And the shock was my book, because she was part of the discourse, she was part of the discussion. They have thematized these topics and the hierarchy and the asymmetries for more than 20 years, over and over again. And she said, well, this was a discourse enclosed in itself, and nobody was interested, and they somehow couldn't reach out to the people, and that's what's happening. Many people, when I go to lectures in the eastern part of Germany, it's always sold out, always. Still, I was in Dresden in the Kulturpalast, 1,800 people were there, and they said, well, we could have double as much. And this is usually the case wherever I go in the East, and people say to me, well, you have spoken from my heart or from my soul. And Sebastian Krumbiegel, who was the leader of the famous pop band Die Prinzen in Germany, said, well, at least somebody said it. And so everybody knows it, and nobody had dared to say it. And a colleague of mine said, well, now we have finally addressed the pink elephant in the room. And this is part of it. And I think it's the personal stance I took in the book and the tone. And I had to understand by myself. I started to think about these things in 2019, when I was asked by a French professor, actually, to say something about the topic. And I said, well, why me? I'm not dealing with this. I deal with German literature from the 18th century till the Weimar Republic, from Goethe to Kafka. That's my field of research, and I'm quite happy there. I'm not pertained by these problems. I could follow up my career. I could become a professor, for instance, and why should I deal with this? And I had to understand that, especially because I could become a professor, I have to talk about it. And the title of the professor in Germany is still something worth. And I'm somehow protected by the title, because you can't say, well, he didn't make it. So he's the typical whining East German. No, that they can't say. It's difficult, at least, to find an argument to say that. So it's the very personal thing, and I thought, well, what can we learn from literature? Literature comes close to the people, and it somehow deals with empathy, it deals with understanding, it deals with showing things instead of explaining things. And I try to with my understanding of literature also. The book is full of philosophical and literary allusions and quotations. And I thought, well, let's try something else. This is not a scientific book. It's not a book with the books you mentioned on Kafka or on the poetic theory of the 18th century. So it's entirely different. It's an entirely different rhetoric register, which tries to come close to the people. And that's also the difference, for instance, to Steffen Mau, with whom I am in a complex and adverse discussion on this, because he always favors the structures. He says, well, the structures are decisive. And I would say the discourse is also decisive, because the discourse you can see at work every day. You open the newspaper and you see whether you are criminalized or pathologized or somehow, was is beleidigt? Offended, assaulted, right. To understand a structure is much more difficult. It takes much longer to identify the limitations you have because you are East German. You can say, well, I can make a career up to a certain point. Women know these as well, know this as well. Yeah, you can become very successful up to a certain point, and then you don't know why is it not going further. And to understand this is very complicated and complex. And I would say it's the structures on the one hand, of course, but it's also the discourse, because the discourse is something with which you have to deal every day over and over again. If you assault a child or if you somehow mistreat a child, it will never forget. It will never forget. And it's the same here. So you can say, well, the East Germans, the Bulgarian politologue, Krassev, yeah. He wrote the book The Light That Faded, and he said, well, the West Europeans have treated the East Europeans like teachers treat pupils, and now they come to now they somehow emancipate and don't follow what the teachers or the parents say, and something like this happens in Germany as well. And there I can come to the timing of to the question of timing. This is very interesting. It's not only that I wrote the book, but that the time was right to read it. And to the Oschmanns, Aleida and Jan Oschmann have shown that after 30 or 40 years, a collective changes its memory somehow. So you can see the Historikerstreit in the 80s, 40 years after. I think Oschmann starts with this speech Weizsäcker had given in 1985 and said Germany was freed of fascism. This was not possible before to say that officially. And now it was possible. It took 40 years. And in 1995 they had the Wehrmachtsausstellung, the exposition about the involvement of the Wehrmacht in the criminal acts of the SS and anything else. So it takes time, and I think we are on this point of time to deal with these questions in a different way. And you can see also how many more East Germans take part in the discourse, and this is very important. It's not just me, it's Kowalczuk, it's Mau, it's Katja Heuer, and many other people who raise their voices and take part and show their different perspectives on these things. And this is also true for the younger generation, the generation that was born, like Katja Heuer, mid-80s, end of 80s, early 90s. They write books about the 90s because they said this was a terrible time. Domenico Mölsien, for instance, a young writer, said this was Abbau Ost, so destruction east and not upswing east, for instance. And so they tried to understand what was happening. And one of the artists born at the end of the 80s said to me, well, in the 90s, my parents didn't take place or were away. I didn't see them because they had to reorganize their entire life. They had to find new jobs, they had to find maybe new partners, new families, maybe new houses, new ways of life. And that's why they couldn't take care of the children. And the children are traumatized in a certain way. Some of them say, well, you could either be right or left, and you can see now how they vote. And that is the point. That is the point. It's not a question of dictatorship in the East. It's, of course, part of this history, of course. But the 90s were traumatizing for many of the people in the East. And the young people also start to write. So it's a very complicated field. a trial to answer your question.
Thank you. So we've got a lot of hands up. We've got another 15 minutes max. I've got you in order, but I'm going to jump the order in one case, which is, for an obvious reason, Katja Heuer, who, as most of you will know, has written a book also on the GDR, but a very different one. Please.
So Katja Heuer, fellow East German and historian and journalist. I subscribe to what you just said, basically. People often ask me why I wrote a book about East Germany now, which came out just a couple of months after Dirk Oschmann's book, and then they were kind of put into the same debate.
The Heuer-Oschmann debate.
Yeah, the Heuer-Oschmann. I've always wanted to be a debate, and that's that box ticked. So I can subscribe to that. There wasn't really, we didn't all sit together and all decide at the same time that we wanted to write a book about the East specifically. There must have been something, to do with the zeitgeist at the time. My question is more about maybe the longevity of this East-West debate, because quite often, or the divide, sorry, because quite often there's an accusation, particularly in the German media, who love this sort of thing, that really this isn't about the GDR and the FRG. It goes way further back. In this country, there's an author, James Hawes, who wrote The Shortest History of Germany, which I understand is still a bestseller, still in all the shops and in all the bookshops, especially kind of for traveling, people in airports and so on. And it pretends to be a neutral history of Germany, but really the core argument is that the East has always been less civilized. It wasn't kind of conquered by the Romans. He goes that far back and basically says anything that's sort of east of the River Elbe has always had a bit of a civilization disadvantage compared to the West. Is there anything at all to this, or would you really push back against this and say it's how the East has been treated and that's it?
I was invited by the Welt last year to talk with James Hawes. Right. And I read the book, and I thought, this is the most racist book I have ever read. To be quite honest, I was stunned. I couldn't believe what I read.
Sorry, by whom was the book?
James Hawes.
Short history.
Yeah, I thought, this was terrible. This is racist. This is chauvinist, and whatever you would say about it. And I didn't talk with him. I denied. That's all I can say with this.
Okay, so now Marcus.
Just shouting. Okay, Marcus Böck, University of Cambridge. So I was born a couple of kilometers west of the Elbe. So I'm a lucky person, and not a savage barbarian. So I thank you very much for your talk, and I really observed how you entered like the big battle about explaining the East in Germany, and made a lot of fuss there, like. Getting the old, pushing things around. I got two questions. One question would basically relate to what Chris earlier asked, because you might know there's a debate introduced by Naika Forutan of Berlin University, who said we should build bridges between other disadvantaged communities in Germany, like migrants and East Germans are basically the same in terms of disadvantages, life quality, life chances, opportunities. If you look to the West, at a Western university, there are not many migrant people, professors, right? So would this be something that you would agree with, and that you think this would be a next step? So not just like doing East German identity politics, but also spreading it out. And the second question, and I hate this question myself, so how to overcome this? And maybe you have a better answer than me. I don't have one, but what would be a proper way out of the mess?
Mm-hmm. Well, these are questions that somehow belong together in my understanding. And I know this thesis about experiences of migrants are similar to experience East Germans have. There is a debate about this because there are also people from other departments, from politics and history, who say, well, don't do this because it's too different. Because, for instance, East Germans are white, so you don't see that they are different. And this makes it much easier in everyday life, for instance. If you apply for an apartment, for instance, and you show up, you're not discriminated from the first place. You have a German name, usually Thomas Müller, for instance. Yes, and you're not discriminated. So there are a couple of other things, so it makes it difficult. And maybe you somehow cover up certain differences which are necessary to understand the complexity of the problem. So I would be very careful in order to compare these experiences. I'm not fully into this discourse. I know it exists, and I can see why it's tempting to do the comparison, but I'm not quite convinced that it goes far enough in the discourse itself. And the second one, how do we overcome the situation? I think the first step, it's an easy one. The media and the politicians and the economy, they have to show the political will or the general will to talk differently about the East. For instance, we had the elections in Brandenburg, Thuringia, and Saxony, what was called the Wahlen im Osten. Yeah? They were not saying, well, we have elections in Saxony and Thuringia, and you would never say, we have Westwahlen. Yeah? We have Ostwahlen, but we never have Westwahlen. When Bavaria or Baden-Württemberg or Saarland is voting, well, you have elections in the Saarland and Bavaria. They take time to say what's going on. It's not going on with regard to the East. So it's a question of language politics, for instance. To differentiate, the East is always treated like one homogeneous block. And it's so different in itself. It's so heterogeneous in itself. And this has to be acknowledged. And it has to be represented in public discourse. And sometimes I think, well, the media start to rethink their position, they start to rethink their acting, and they try to show things in a more complex way. For instance, the Deutschlandfunk, which I think is really a good broadcasting station, had something on Nazis in Chemnitz. Well, I thought, well, okay, that's the usual thing, Nazis in Chemnitz, tell me something new. But the new thing was that they showed how they are connected with the Nazis in Dortmund and how they have corporations, they exchange people, they share the same money and other things, they share the same networks. So this was to show that we have a problem that is relevant in entire Germany. It's not just an East German problem. So we are dealing with problems that are pertaining to entire Germany. And I think these things have to grow. These things have to be made for a start, namely to differentiate, to show things in complexity, not to use the East as a bad bank where all the problems are located, but to show how things are somehow working like communicating pipes, as I said. And you can only understand this. And also when Frau Baerbock talks about German history since 1945, it's always only the history of the FRG. The Bundesrepublik. He has no idea whatsoever that there is an Eastern state, or there has been an Eastern state. And I think it's a question of the political will and the general will of changing something to give you the idea that you are talking on eye level and that you are taken seriously. It's the first step. It doesn't solve all the problems at once, but it's the first step in solving problems. And the second one would be to introduce quotas. Nobody likes it, of course, but it's the only way to have a hard political instrument to change the problem of underrepresentation.
Thank you. Now we're running out of time, so I'm going to take the last three together. Tara, and then Martin Ruhl, and then Philipp Oltermann. Please. Yes. But we'll take them all together and then respond. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Tara Windsor. I'm a research associate in German here. I've got a comment and then a question. The comment is just to pick up on what you were saying on Marcus's question about migrants and East Germans. And maybe just to point out that not all East Germans are white. I do absolutely agree that it's important to have an awareness of critical whiteness, but at the same time, not all East Germans of colour are migrants either. And that in saying that kind of thing, I know you were sort of saying, you were passing on indirectly what other people have said, but that it's important to remember that in claiming that East Germans are white, you're also creating a double marginalisation, which lots of people like Patrice Petrus, Katharina Wader have written and spoken about very prominently in media. So yeah, I just wanted to have kind of thrown that in. And if you would like to comment on that please do, but otherwise don't worry. And the other question actually though was referring to the slide that you had on before that had an image from the Bundesstiftung Aufarbeitung. And you've kind of started alluding to memory politics a little bit, but I wondered if you might be able to say something about what role you think agencies like the Stiftung Aufarbeitung have played in this discourse about the East and the memory politics that have been kind of, the dominant discourses of memory politics about the East and how that plays into the division.
Thank you. Martin. If you can, everybody can keep it as brief as possible, please.
Thank you. Martin Ruhl, like Tara, Germanist here in Cambridge, and selbstbekennender Wessi, hopefully not a besser Wessi. I just want to ask you, maybe bring you back to the question: did reunification fail? How could it not have failed? Is my question, right? For so many in the West, it seemed like a victory of their system over the system in the East. It would have taken superhuman efforts of empathy to not be and not to behave arrogantly towards the losers. And maybe the second question, very quickly, Brendan, sorry. You made a remarkable comment there that if people in Gelsenkirchen, and I think you said Pforzheim, suffered the same kind of precarity that people in the East, former East, suffered, we would have the same kind of voting behaviors. How can you prove that? I find that quite questionable, that remark.
Okay, and finally, Philip.
Thank you, Philip Alterman. I'm a journalist for The Guardian.
Can you raise your voice? Because that you don't need to shout into that, but for the benefit of everybody else.
Alterman I'm a journalist for The Guardian. Thank you for the talk. I found a lot of your talk and a lot of your writing very convincing. Sometimes there's sort of moments where I think that could also be an argument for the other side of the argument, and I was just going to mention two of those. You mentioned that the fact that the FPÖ gets 30% in Austria, would disprove the theory that there's something inherently authoritarian-loving about the East. But I just wonder whether, on the flip side, doesn't it also show that those 30% can't just be an invention of the West, of Western Germany, because it's Austria. We're seeing the same sort of percentages in other parts of Europe, and not just eastern parts of Europe. And I just wondered how you explain those 30% in Saxony, Thuringia, etc. And the other question, you mentioned Pep Guardiola. I was going to mention Tony Kroos, whom you mentioned also in your FATS article, which I think kicked off the book. And you say, I think you mentioned Angela Merkel and Tony Kroos as the only Germans who are East Germans, but recognized as Germans. But I wonder, Tony Kroos and Angela Merkel at that point were the biggest, most famous, most respected Germans in the world. And I just wonder isn't that also a counter-argument that we have reached that point where that is possible?
To start with the last question, this is just for fun. Yeah? And the son of Joachim Gauck wrote me a real bad letter about not mentioning his father. His father is also a famous East German who has made it, but he didn't understand the argument. I was just making fun. The third one was Durst Grünbein, the writer. So Angela Merkel, Tony Kroos, and Durst Grünbein. These are the three East Germans who are not visibly East Germans, or who are not understood as East Germans. This is just for fun, just to show the absurdity of the situation. And maybe I will continue with your first question already. Of course, there is something like an East German identity in itself. I don't deny that. But this is totally different from what the West Germans construct as East German identity. So this is a discursive effect I try to reconstruct, namely what the ascription of identity makes with East Germans. And I rely on the French philosopher Jacques Rancière. You have the right not to accept an identity that is ascribed to you. And the paradox is, you have to identify with this identity that is described in the first place. That is the paradox you can't leave behind. And of course, East Germans have a specific historical, political, cultural experience that is totally different from what the West has. But on the other hand, this is totally different from, in comparison to what the West thinks the East Germans are. That's the difference I'm trying to make. And this is something which my critics usually don't understand. They say, well, there is an East German identity. Well, of course, I don't deny that. I only say it's totally different from that what the West is ascribing to the East. These are two different things, entirely different. Okay, the second one, the Gelsenkirchen-Frage. You just have to look up how they voted for the AfD in the last elections, and you will have to look up next year when they are going to vote. Just try to see how many people in these precarious areas vote for the AfD. And you could see last year, like in Bavaria and in Hesse, people voted for the AfD around 15%. Only then the Bundesregierung started to think about migration. As long as East Germans voted for the AfD, they said, well, it's just East Germans. These are sick people. Yeah, we don't have to talk about migration. But when the West started to have to show the same numbers, they started to deal with on a public scale and on an entire, or on a scale which pertains to the entire country. And this is usually the same pattern. As long as it is only in the East, they don't care. As soon as the West is somehow going in the same direction, they react. And we will see, and you have to take into account that in Bavaria you had 15% voters for the AfD, but you had also the CSU and you have the Freie Wähler. And this sums up to 70%. If you wouldn't have the CSU and the Freie Wähler, the AfD would have been much stronger. I would say it would have been the same numbers that we see in Saxony and in Thuringia. You could say, well, this is just speculation. Just wait and see till next year. And you will see that. And the second question was, well, the West Germans could just celebrate their victory after 1990. Well, this just doesn't fit with the idea of reunification. It doesn't fit with the paragraph 146, the so-called unification paragraph, which would have led to a new constitution or to the discussion of a new constitution. And even if you could say, well, the Grundgesetz is great, yeah, nothing against that. You could also follow the American system with the amendments. If the reality changes in the United States, you can have an amendment. And nothing changed the reality more than the reunification in 1990. So the Grundgesetz was changed more than 60 times since 1949, but not in 1990 when there was the most important change at all. And the politicians or the people in power didn't see any necessity. And Habermas said, well, the Einigungsvertrag or the treaty of the reunification was a treaty that Wolfgang Schäuble has basically worked out with himself. Also, das ist der Vertrag, den Herr Schäuble mit sich selbst geschlossen hat. This is what Habermas is saying. Yeah? And this is the most important thing here. So there was no idea of we are going to turn in a bigger country, in a different country, and the West didn't understand that it had to change itself, that the political and general situation is entirely different. And so we can't go on in the same track. And I was in the United States as a student in 1992, and I was invited to a discussion about the problems of reunification. So it's 32 years ago, but we are not going further. And there were two people from Switzerland there, and they said, well, this is actually uncanny for us that there is this big German country in the north again. So what will they do to us again? And this was very interesting that they could say that, well, this is the sheer land mass Germany is now again, seems a kind of Bedrohung for them. And so people in the West basically had obviously the feeling, well, nothing has changed. We are a little bit bigger, but nothing else has changed, and we don't have to change. And there are West Germans, of course, who had a feeling that something's going on here. The writer Patrick Süskind wrote an article in summer 1990. It's the writer of the perfume. And he said, well, I had a very good and cozy life. I was born in 1950. All of my life I have lived in West Germany, and it was a great life, a free life, a rich life. And I was leaning with my back on the wall, looking toward Paris and New York. And now the wall has come down, and I have to turn, and I fell down and have to deal with Cottbus and Hoyerswerda. And what do I do with this? So this was interesting. So this is a man in his 40s, or he was 40 years old, and in a very dialectical way he described that the country is changing and will be changing in the future, and he has to come to terms with it. And somebody like him understood what's going on in a very reflected way. And I would have wished more of these reflections would have occurred. And the last two questions, I can't say much about the Bundesstiftung Aufarbeitung. I know this institution, of course, but I couldn't dare to describe the role it has in this politics of memory, the politics at all. And you are totally right with your comment. And yeah, I can only apologize for being so simplistic on this point.
Thank you. And I know there are many other questions. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We have a reception waiting for us. But I think, Dirk Oschmann, it's a testament to your lecture, to the discussion, that people want to continue the conversation, which indeed we shall do. But we end the formal proceedings here, not before doing three things. First of all, to reiterate our invitation to join us for drinks in a minute. Secondly, those of you who would like to continue with the Center for Geopolitics, next week we have a meeting in Peterhouse on the 27th at 5:30 in the theatre, which is on Peterhouse Women in Geopolitics, to mark the 40th anniversary of the admission to women to Peterhouse. The panel will be chaired by Bridget Kendall, former master of Peterhouse, and of course herself a noted analyst of geopolitics. And lastly, of course, Dirk Oschmann, we'd like to thank you very much indeed for escaping, at least briefly, your state of exception, for subjecting your voice once again to the Strapazen, as it were, of delivering this lecture and sharing your thoughts and engaging with us. Thank you very much indeed.